all research is a collective effort, and so we'd really like to acknowledge key partners and colleagues who have joined us in working on this project, including the Warwick Doctoral College and our advisory board who have supported this project, or both of these projects all the way through. And I know some members of our advisory board are here today, which is great to see. We'd also like to acknowledge Julie from Active4 Research, who supported the production of some key project outputs related to this project as well. Of course, we also need to acknowledge our funders. The two projects that we're sharing today were funded by Research England Enhancing Research Culture funding that was administered through Warwick. We received some funding in the March to July round in 2022, and then the January to July round in 2023. And just before I sort of move on and tell you about what we're going to be doing today, I just want to acknowledge that some of you may have heard aspects of these findings before. We've had some interactive workshops across Warwick and across the wider sector, but many of you have also asked for an opportunity to hear the project findings in a bit more detail. And so we're going to be doing that today, sharing the findings and having an opportunity to look at the projects as a whole. So let me move on. So this is the project. My name's Dr. James Burford. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Education Studies, and my colleague Emily will be presenting with me today. Our research assistants are also with us in the event, and they'll be available to answer questions at the end of the event. But to sort of move through as seamlessly as possible, Emily and I will be presenting today. So here's the full project team. I was the project lead in phase 1 with Emily and Sophia Kier-Beifeld, Ahmed Akkad and Dengani. Our fantastic project illustrator is Kate Carruthers-Thomas, and you'll see her illustrations peppered through this presentation. And in phase 2 of the project, it was myself, Emily and Sophia, and we also had a placement intern, Anam Mahmoud, who was also working with us on the project. So all of the hard work is definitely shared by all of the members of our team. So let me give you an overview of the presentation that we're hoping to give today. We're going to start by introducing the project and the key concepts associated with the project. We'll then move on to briefly introduce some of the literature that we surveyed for the project and introduce the project design. Then I'll hand over to Emily, who's going to talk about our project findings and the recommendations that are emerging from the project. So some of you might be coming today wondering what on earth this PADC thing is that we're talking about. What are pre-admissions doctoral communications? This is a concept that was coined by our project team, and we define it as communications that potential doctoral applicants have with university staff prior to making a formal application to study. So pre-admissions doctoral communications are all of the kinds of communications that applicants have prior to the formal admissions stage. So we're also including not only interactions between students and staff, but also forwarded communications or communications that staff might have with each other about communications from potential doctoral applicants. So this is the key concept that we're drilling into and investigating in our project. In terms of the forms of pre-admissions doctoral communications, these may include emails, and often this is the most common form of communication, from applicants to supervisors, program officers or directors of PGR programs. As I said too, they include forwarded communications within departments, but we're not only talking about emails in this project, we're also talking about video and phone calls, applicants possibly knocking on an office door and dropping by, perhaps applicants approaching potential supervisors on social media or at conferences. We're talking about a wide range of forms of communication. And a key thing to sort of acknowledge at the outset is that while PADC is near ubiquitous in some disciplines in the UK, particularly in the social sciences and humanities, there might be less PADC in other disciplines. And so this is also reflected throughout our study. So a key concept or idea lying at the heart of our project is that PADC may be a gatekeeping moment in doctoral education. Through PADC, university staff can become gatekeepers to doctoral education and therefore by extension to the academic profession itself. And so this means that it's a really perhaps small moment in a doctoral experience, but potentially a really important issue. We know that respondents to doctoral application inquiries might make snap judgments, perhaps giving limited thought to their gatekeeping function. So emails come in thick and fast, and supervisors or others might make quick decisions. And we also know that this tends to disadvantage underrepresented students who might have less access to key informants or reliable sources to explain the doctoral application process to them. So we know that applicants come in with different levels of information and experience in relation to navigating this process. So in our study, we conducted a literature review at the beginning, and what we found is that much of the scholarship around doctoral admissions focuses on the exclusionary nature of the admissions process, particularly focusing on admissions criteria. This is a key strain in the literature. There's been other studies which have looked at how staff academic identities influence decision-making and how often staff might be looking for people like themselves and reproducing the academy that is. We know that many studies are US focused, and that means that there's a common focus on GRE, but also processes of deliberative bureaucracy where committees are formed in order to discuss admissions processes. Also, these ideas of holistic admissions, which are very common in the US. But many studies are also discipline specific, and few take a kind of cross-institutional approach. PADC is also rarely covered in existing research, so much of the research is focused on the formal admissions process, which is why we felt it was so important to look at this informal pre-admissions process as well. So how did we design our project? We've done quite a lot over the last few years. So we've had semi-structured interviews, and so let me first talk about part one of the project. This involves semi-structured interviews with 12 directors of PGR programs. So those are academic staff who are leading PGR programs, and 8 doctoral program officers. And these participants were drawn from across Warwick faculties. And they undertook a 1-hour semi-structured interview, which focused on their role in relation to postgraduate research, in relation to PADC, in relation to connected inclusivity practices. In addition to semi-structured interviews with DPGRs and program officers, we also had solicited diaries and focus groups, and these were conducted with 19 doctoral supervisors in total. 19 participated in the diary study, which represented 60 applicants. So they had interactions with 60 applicants. We also had 3 focus groups with a total of 11 supervisors, again, drawn from across Warwick faculties. In terms of this, the diary, this was a solicited diary occurring over 6 weeks, using online forms via Qualtrics, and the focus group discussions were an opportunity to follow up on questions that emerged from the diary itself. So that was the empirical work in phase 1 of the project. In addition to this, we also had a web review, which undertook a review of departmental and institutional doctoral admissions web pages at Warwick. Then, coming to phase 2 of the project, again, we had some semi-structured interviews, but this time we wanted to focus on the experiences of students. And so we chose to conduct interviews with students who come from minoritized backgrounds. Again, this was a 1-hour semi-structured interview focused on their journeys through to doctoral study, their pre-application doctoral communications experiences, and any experiences of minoritization therein. Again, we had students participating from across Warwick faculties and representing various axes of inequality. And so, yeah, you'll see some of that reflected in the findings that we share. In addition to this, we also conducted an analysis of YouTube videos that are available on in public. We developed a corpus of 100 YouTube videos focused on how to find a potential doctoral supervisor in related search terms. And then we took 10 videos with the highest views as a sample for more in-depth analysis. And our goal in conducting this YouTube video study was to understand that not only do students call upon institutional resources when they're navigating through PADC, they also draw upon a wide array of public resources too. And so we wanted to know what kind of advice might students be being exposed to as they navigate this process. So that's a rough rundown of our project summary. I'm going to hand over now to Emily, who's going to share more about the project findings.
Thanks, Jamie. Next slide, please. So we're going to run through the key findings from each aspect of the project in a sort of concise detail as possible. So firstly, from the web page review, and we know that PGR web pages are key sources of information for applicants and are sort of the go-to source for applicants to consult for admissions guidance. And we did find that there were commonalities across the university department web pages, including, for example, key contacts, how admissions works, what funding is available, how to identify a supervisor, and the fact that a research proposal is required and what might be involved. However, we did find that there were some general missing information on the web pages that could be quite crucial. So firstly, how decisions are made about admissions tends to be missing from web pages. So applicants are not necessarily aware of how their application is going to be reviewed. And secondly, with the exception of a couple of departments, no departments included any information around EDI priorities or inclusivity, or, for example, explicitly stating that they would welcome applications from students from minoritized backgrounds. Thanks, Jamie. So if we next move on to our second stakeholder group, thank you, which is the role of directors of PGR. Firstly, we found that, and we have to always state that Warwick is a highly decentralized institution with quite a lot of departmental autonomy. So that's always the context that we need to present when considering our institutional case study. But we also believe this to be the case in other institutions as well, that the role of director of PGR in a department varies quite substantially between departments and also changes a lot over time. And that obviously poses a challenge if one wishes to formalize PADC processes, how to do that given that the leadership of the area is really quite different. However, what we can say is that the vast majority of those who are directors of PGR programs in departments are dealing with pre-application doctoral communication. So there is a basic level of engagement there. When we look at DPGR's actual role in looking at pre-application doctoral communications, a major role is in terms of answering admission-related queries from applicants and supervisors alike. Many of these queries are directed at program officers, but then there are specific queries that do come to these directors. And directors of PGR also are instrumental in linking applicants with potential supervisors. Something we found, and it may not be particularly surprising given a lot of academia works like this, that a lot of the processes around PADC are rather more habitual than intentional, in that they've been sort of somehow established over time and reproduced rather than necessarily being specifically kind of revised according to, say, changing institutional priorities. And something else we found is that one might have a specific DPGR who has maybe an EDI informed approach. And when they move on to, move out of the role, that kind of practice can be lost. So it can be that a specific DPGR comes to the role with a particular way of doing things that then they move on and that disappears. We asked DPGRs to what extent they feel that in their roles they're enacting a certain level of gatekeeping around admissions. And they did tend to recognise that gatekeeping was occurring, but didn't necessarily see this as unfairly handled, and indeed often saw it more as a kind of screening, because not all applicants can get through to be processed in the same way. I think we can see from the quote on the right-hand side from Olivia, the PGR in the social science department, that there is some ambivalence, though, saying it's complex work and that she doesn't always feel 100% happy about it, that there's some doubt entering there, perhaps. Thanks, Jamie. So now moving on to the role of programme officers. Once again, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the administrative roles, professional services roles relating to PGR also vary quite substantially across the institution in terms of remit. But again, what we can say is that PADC is a major stream of work for programme officers who work on the area of PGR. However, sometimes the responsibility is unclear as to who has the final word. And again, we can say there's a lack of formal PADC processes. Again, these often develop and consolidate over time and then are kind of inherited rather than being sort of deliberately constructed. In terms of the programme officer role, the role majorly involves responding to queries from potential applicants, and this can be around most common topics: eligibility, funding opportunities, and how to identify a potential supervisor. We do find scattered across our data evidence that administrative decisions are gatekeeping decisions. So, for example, programme officers sometimes make decisions about whether to forward an email from an applicant onto an academic for further consideration, or whether to simply perhaps reply and say, maybe check the website for more details. And although that seems like a technical, momentary decision, an administrative decision, of course, it does prioritise some applicants over another. So there's some aspect of gatekeeping happening within administrative work. When we asked programme officers whether they feel they're engaging in gatekeeping, they do acknowledge that gatekeeping occurs, but there's also a level of frustration in that there are many applicant queries that repeat the same questions when the information is, in theory, clearly provided on the web page. So we saw that sort of disconnect between web pages and questions being asked and queries of why these same questions keep coming back and back again. If we look at the quote from Bluebell in the box on the left-hand side, you can see from Bluebell's quote that she was recognising that there are gatekeeping moments in programme officer work, and she felt she could see the ones that are a definite no, which I think clearly shows us that the administrative work does involve making some admissions decisions. Thank you. If we now move on to our next stakeholder group, so looking at doctoral supervisors themselves, we found many kind of institutional and what we might call sector-related issues around supervisor capacity. That's capacity of the number of students any one supervisor could take on, and the limit on how many new students a supervisor could take on in 1 year. And that feeds into issues around things like that doctoral education is often not the most lucrative set of education within the institution. So we can see that there's quite intensive competition for applicants to work with certain supervisors. And we realise the graph at the bottom of the page there is quite small, but it's just simply to show you, this is from our 6-week diary study, showing per supervisor the number of new applicants that contacted them during this time. And you can see that there's a great disparity between one supervisor being contacted by 14 new applicants within 6 weeks, another by 9, and then others didn't receive any approaches at all during that time. So there's also an issue around specific supervisor popularity, which also leads to capacity issues. Supervisors were positive about formal institutional processes for managing PADC, such as being provided with template emails or being asked to forward inquiries to programme officers so that they could deal with it. But at the same time, as is often common with supervisors, I have to have a chuckle, that they're often not necessarily aware of these formal processes or obeying these processes. There's a great deal of supervisor autonomy that goes on. And so this is a caution as to whether PADC can ever be fully formalized when supervisors are the way they are. We also find that supervisors, also a common kind of autonomous academic trait, is that they've developed their own processes for managing PADC. So some of that is around adding content to the web profiles about their supervision interests, and also developing their own criteria for evaluating PADC quality. And we can't go into this here, but in the final report and also a forthcoming publication, we set out in great detail the minuscule decision-making that supervisors engage in when deciding if an approach email has potential. We have to also be aware that decisions are made about PADC by supervisors with some knowledge being discerned of applicants' identity. So we saw that that many applicants stated their nationality when they wrote to supervisors, and also that from things like names, that supervisors were discerning the gender of applicants. So there's some knowledge of intersecting characteristics that's going on when supervisors are making these decisions. And through the diary, we tried to understand the extent to which supervisors are taking different decisions about these emails they're receiving, and how these are based on their own personal priorities and principles, why they would decline interest in supervising, and why they would, for example, perhaps forward an email to another supervisor, and how all of these moments are, to an extent, gatekeeping decisions, because they basically shore up or prevent an applicant from accessing the formal admission process. You can see on the right-hand side a quote from Agatha, a supervisor in social science, where she was explaining sort of one of her sort of areas of resistance to a particular email she had received, where she stated the email was clearly not targeted at me, it was addressed to Dear Sir. And this sort of clear evidence that the student perhaps the applicant hadn't had maybe copy and pasted the same email to several supervisors or some such. Even that entered into the sort of decision making about whether this was someone that deserved time or not. Thanks, Jamie. So what we tried to establish through the PADC1 project, the first project, was the extent to which applicants may be considered advantaged or disadvantaged during the PADC process. So we specifically asked stakeholders to reveal this. The groups that were sort of singled out were around mature students who may no longer be obviously based in institutions and therefore find it harder to get back in, or those who are working similarly. Those with different educational backgrounds, including also non-UK qualifications, sometimes experience issues, and those applying from global south contexts, potentially without necessarily as much access to academic resources to shore up the academic profile of their proposal. And there were also a sense that applicants from some specific countries or regional contexts, such as China, Africa, and the Middle East, might be disadvantaged because of particular associations with those contexts. We also saw that some students appeared to be advantaged. Those who were already studying in the university within Warwick were seen as being somewhat advantaged because they already understood the system to an extent and perhaps could have a recommendation from a current tutor. Those with UK qualifications, even if they were from international backgrounds, were also seen as advantaged. Those from Anglophone contexts, and also potentially those with government funding, although this was also at times a disadvantage as there were some negative associations with this. In the second PADC study, so taking some of these suggested angles of advantage and disadvantage, we sought to deliberately investigate these areas and other categories of minoritization, such as disability, BAME, class, and those students who are first in family to access higher education. Thanks, Jamie. So our findings from our PADC2 study, we particularly focused on, and we'll just present here, on the enabling factors and the barriers. So participants, when they traced back their experiences of applying for doctoral education, they identified that specific enabling factors included support from family and peers and encouragement, as well as having some family experience of the UK higher education system or some knowledge from some sources of academia. Support from academic staff, both from previous qualifications, but also from the institution that they were applying for, was seen as key, but that there was an element of luck in terms of who one ended up happening upon and who might help. Online resources were seen as helpful, and this, we'll talk a bit more about the YouTube study in a minute, but that ties in there. And something that was identified as really important and is something for us to be considering is early exposure to research. So that's actually accessing experiences working on research projects through earlier levels of education. And of course, and something we'd really hope for is that clear application information is seen as helpful. But we did also see quite a few barriers coming up. So, for example, there being an absence of staff support or a lack of replies from staff in relation to PADC contact, even some incorrect advice being given along the way, and also an issue of actually having limited access to online information. So when online information is so important and then there's limited access, we could look back to the issues of frustration we saw amongst the administrative staff and can draw some connections there about where there's lack of access to online information, why that might result in more queries that might then be seen as frustrating. It was also felt by minoritized PGRs that there was some limited awareness of EDI issues, and also perhaps a lack of representation of minority staff members, which somewhat made the whole experience feel perhaps more alienating. You can see an example here on the left-hand side from Harvinder, who was a PGR in science and who had a disability. And actually, and this quote is not necessarily related to Warwick, but a supervisor, potential supervisor that Harvinder was communicating with, was actually asking, are you going to be extremely slow? Do you need to go part-time? And this is obviously, we can interpret this as somewhat discriminatory practice and very dissuading of applying for the formal PhD. Thanks, Jamie. So finally, then the final aspect of our study is around the role of online advice videos. This is in the context, and dare any of you after this event to go and have a look on YouTube and see what you find. But there are numerous online advice videos from formal institutions, from different associations, academics, and also from doctoral students, providing guidance on how to apply for a doctorate, which is obviously particularly useful for underrepresented communities. And the content of these videos includes things such as how to use institutional web pages to find supervisors, how to ensure an interest match with a supervisor, how to contact a supervisor, and even how to draft the email. We do want to add a note of caution, though, that of course these resources are extremely helpful, but that there is a focus on encouraging students to sort of adapt to expectations rather than encouraging students to challenge the status quo. It's more about learning the mechanisms of success. There was also quite a lot of a sense that the videos were originating from an unarticulated but specific context, often the US admissions system, which is quite specific. And that means that, of course, some of the guidance could be interpreted incorrectly in different contexts. And some of the information we found to be actually misleading or unhelpful. So, of course, those who are relying heavily on these videos may also find themselves in a bit of a sticky situation. Thanks, Jamie. So having given a sort of whistle-stop tour of our findings, we're now going to give an equally whistle-stop tour of our recommendations. Just a reminder that all of these can be found in much more detail in our final project report, which is available online. So we produced 3 specific sets of recommendations, and each one takes the form of a project briefing. And the first one is more at the institutional and departmental level. So firstly, we recommend to develop pre-application communication strategies So to think about, for example, a pre-application form, online events, and actually just to work together at the department level to think about how to manage PADC or track it. And that is all within the caveat that we said earlier, that we think it's probably impossible to completely formalize the PADC project, that there will always be leaky areas, but that some additional management would probably be helpful in enhancing inclusivity. We also recommend to enhance professional development, training and reflective practice in this area, to create information and discussion spaces such as we're doing today and have tried to do in previous workshops. And also that there needs to be a really clear handover when a new DPGR or a new programme officer or new supervisors start in their roles, to make sure that practice that has been developed isn't lost. And of course, a theme that's been coming up a lot is around developing clear web page information, and potentially even actually showing the web page information to new entrants to the doctoral programme and to get feedback on it, to continually update it, check it, and make sure it's extremely clear and up to date. Thank you. So secondly, our second briefing is targeted at supervisors, given that they play such a huge role in doctoral admissions, especially where the supervisor is allocated at the stage of admissions. The first is for supervisors to think about how they're managing pre-application doctoral communications. We're very well aware, and we experience ourselves, that we get email overload about applicants that sometimes mean we can slip up and not reply, or not necessarily give the most helpful advice. So how to sort of think about not adding to the burden too much of more email communication, but how to think about doing this efficiently but fairly at the same time. So thinking about how to update the staff profile with more information about supervision interests, and maybe consider having some template text for common queries. And secondly, thinking about how to respond to these communications, potentially seeking a second opinion, setting up an informal video call, maybe thinking of referring applicants to other colleagues who might be, for example, earlier career supervisors, and also only encouraging formal applications proportionately to supervisory capacity. So perhaps not encouraging 10 people to apply to work with you when you have 1 or 2 spaces. And finally, to engage in reflective practice around doctoral communication. So actually thinking about these things with colleagues, we found that this project has opened up a lot of discussion channels, and lots of people, sorts of supervisors, are feeling potentially quite stressed and overwhelmed by PADC as a phenomenon. So thinking about how to talk about this more and reflect on it is really an important avenue. Thank you. And finally, we developed a briefing for PGR applicants and those supporting them. So those supporting them might also include, for example, personal tutors or tutors on master's programmes that might be encouraging students to apply. So our recommendations include locating the institution one wants to apply for and what the funding opportunities might be, and clearly, carefully reading all the information that's provided, and possibly reaching out to staff from previous studies and thinking about who might be a suitable supervisor, or which might be a good institution. And then actually for doctoral processes that require searching for a supervisor, looking for a clear subject area match. That came up very strongly in our study, that match is very important, but also looking at who might, for example, express a leaning towards social justice on their profile. That might mean that they're particularly willing to work with minoritized students, for example. And then around contacting a potential supervisor and next steps, we've given some guidance on how to contact a supervisor, and that's specifically using the findings from our study about what supervisors sort of preferred to see in an email. So we've tried to give us a real life sense of what supervisors were doing with emails. Thanks, Jamie. So we're just concluding our presentation, formal presentation now, just with a summary of the main project outputs, which can all be found using this QR code if you wish. So we produced a final project report. All of these are open access, I should say. And we produced a professional development activity kit for supervisors, which involves a structured discussion exercise, looking at some sample emails and thinking about how to respond. We produced the 3 briefings that I've already just touched on in my previous recommendation slides. And we ourselves produced a research-informed YouTube advice video, which you're very welcome to have a look at on YouTube. You can get it to it via our webpage. And in that, we tried to model the best practice for this kind of video that we've garnered from other videos and from our own research project to try and produce a really informative resource for students who are considering doctoral study. Thank you. So thank you. This concludes our formal presentation, and you're, as I say, very welcome to look up our resources. And I'm now going to hand back to Jamie at this point. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Emily. So as Emily said, that's quite enough talking from us. So what we'd like to do is hand over to you now. What we'd like to ask you to do first is to take maybe a few moments to think through the findings and recommendations we've just presented and think about what might be the most relevant findings for you or recommendations for you. So Dangani, if you haven't already, would you mind posting those briefing documents into the chat? Fab. So if you would have a look, choose which briefing might be the most relevant for you and just take a few moments to look over it. They're all very short, and so 5 minutes should be plenty. And yeah, what we'd like you to do is to consider whether there are any actions that you could undertake to make the PADC process more equitable, more inclusive for you and for the applicants who are working with you, but also within your departments and across the institution more broadly. So I'd like to just give you a few minutes to look at a relevant briefing for you. And if you notice any actions that you could take, it would be really fantastic if you would post any thoughts that you might have in the chat. And then afterwards, we'll also have time for a wider Q&A discussion. So I'll just leave you for a few moments to have a look at those briefings now, and then we'll come back.